Kia ora and welcome to this really special Manaaki Whenua Link online webinar. We're bringing together expertise from the Department of Conservation, the Ministry for the Environment and Manaaki Whenua to discuss biodiversity monitoring and tracking in New Zealand. This is all in the light of the newly agreed Global Biodiversity Framework. This is therefore a follow-up to the recent webinar which introduced the GBF for short, but rest assured our presentation will still make sense if you didn't attend the earlier event. Our presenters today include Elaine Wright, and she's the Principal Science Advisor Monitoring and Evaluation in the Biodiversity Group at the Department of Conservation. Anne-Gail Osei, who is a Principal Scientist at the Ministry for the Environment, and Peter Bellingham, a Senior Researcher in Ecosystems and Conservation at Manaaki Whenua. They're joined on the panel by Maya Hunt, Senior International Advisor, who presented a couple of weeks ago, and Jeff Daly. And Jeff is the Principal Technical Advisor for Social Monitoring and Evaluation, also at the Department of Conservation. They'll mostly just support the Q&A at the end. We added it up. The collective experience before you adds up to no less than a century of research, policy, engagement and progress in biodiversity protection in New Zealand, as well as influence across the world. Manaaki Whenua, the Department of Conservation and the Ministry of Environment work in partnership across a wide range of science, policy and practical projects to enhance New Zealand's biodiversity, and we're really delighted to present this webinar series together. That's enough from me. Over to the team.
Morena koutou, kia ora koutou. Called Peter Bellingham, tōku ingoa, and I've drawn the straw to present on behalf of 4 of us. I'm going to talk to you about how New Zealand is tracking its contribution to global biodiversity goals, and it builds on the seminar that you heard. Well, those of you who were present were fortunate to hear from Maya Hunt a couple of weeks ago. Just to give you an outline of what we're talking about, there will be a bit of a refresher about New Zealand's obligations under the UN Convention for Biodiversity and the 2050 goals and 2030 targets that were agreed last year under the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. We'll talk about our own response in terms of national biodiversity and environmental goals, objectives and legislation. The bulk of the talk is going to focus on the development of an interagency outcome monitoring framework that determines progress towards meeting both those international targets and national outcomes. We'll talk about a process of building consensus that has been run over the past 2 years across government agencies in order to achieve that. I'll emphasise that there are international best practices that can help us, and we'll end on investment gaps and opportunities. First of all, to give us a little bit of context here. This is the global decline that is evident in biodiversity. This is our existential crisis alongside that of climate change, one of the defining problems of our era. And the other thing that is salient in the graph that's presented to you there is that the global biodiversity conventions, the conventions of the party, successive targets agreed for Aichi for 2010 haven't deflected that trajectory. We have to do better. Nicely put by Georgina Mace, we really need a substantial transformative approach, and otherwise we'll certainly repeat the failures of the past. It's also important to remember Aotearoa's global contribution because we are a global biodiversity hotspot. More than 80% of most of our native species, plants 85%, many of the insect groups over 90% are found nowhere else. And so there is no plan B that doesn't involve New Zealand for protecting our flora and fauna. Again, going back to Maya's presentation, for those of you who were familiar with it, just a familiarisation process here. New Zealanders are represented on the International Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which is a parallel process similar to that run for climate change. And we contribute both in terms of appearing in global forums and the scientific heft behind it. The body of evidence shows that indirect drivers listed there, direct drivers such as land and sea use change, exploitation, climate change, have degraded ecosystems, are causing loss of species diversity and genetic diversity as well, and that human well-being is being jeopardized. All of this set the context for the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And what's important there is that it recognized that without an enabling environment, without more responsibility and transparency, we're in danger of doing this, we're in danger of repeating the mistakes of the past. So the targets that were agreed in for 2030 focus on tools and solutions, reducing threats and meeting people's needs. But it's important too to look through to the goals and the ultimate vision that people are living more in harmony with nature. I emphasised before that there is a national response to that, Te Mano Te Taiao, and I'll dwell at length on that, but it also occurs against a background of other legislation, policy, and so forth. Most of these are listed here, but they are current imperatives and many of them will grow. Some of those are listed towards the bottom. We can expect to see reform of the Wildlife Act. There is impending reform of New Zealand's Biosecurity Act. There are problems that are currently not being responded to, such as the Waitangi Tribunal's response to Y262. All of these may sit as drivers for better monitoring of environmental and biodiversity outcomes. Te Mano Te Taiao is New Zealand's biodiversity strategy, sometimes called the Aotearoa New Zealand Biodiversity Strategy, and that was completed in 2020, and it fits as New Zealand's National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. It was completed in 2020. The implementation plans are being developed, but the area that I want to focus on in particular that gives context for this presentation is our national response to the need for a global monitoring framework, and that is the development here of the interagency outcome monitoring framework. There's a reason and an imperative that this is important. You'll see that our first national report on meeting the targets is due in 2026. I will talk about how well equipped our current state of producing the evidence needed for that is as we go on. A point I want to make is that this isn't our first biodiversity strategy. We've had one before. We had one that was developed in the year 2000, and it focused on the sort of things that New Zealand is a global leader in, particularly reducing threats like animal pests and so forth. But a critique of that 2000 biodiversity strategy said it wasn't making much difference. And in my experience, by 2010, a decade after it had been written, it was barely even mentioned, it was barely acknowledged. We need to do things differently. And that's why I've emphasized here that the new biodiversity strategy, Te Mano o Te Taiao, is about the transformational change that is required to do that. It's rested on 3 po, tiaki, which is protecting and restoring. That's the sort of thing we do well. But importantly, getting the system right, tuapapa and whakahau, empowering action, are both equally important. And unless all 3 are enacted, we won't see the kind of transformational change that is required to arrest the decline in biodiversity. This all plays out in an international context. Of course, we were well aware of the international arena. So in this slide, I'm overlaying where tuapapa sits in a global context alongside the economic and incentives and laws and regulatory policies that are required. Whakahau, recognizing that behavioral change is imperative. Tiaki recognizes all those pressures that we're well accustomed to, land use, climate change, pollution, and so forth. But importantly, the Te Mano o Te Taiao recognises different kinds of outcomes from those that the last iteration did. The previous one focused only on outcomes that were around healthy and resilient ecosystems. Those outcomes are respectively that ecosystems from mountaintops to ocean depths are thriving and that indigenous species and habitats are thriving in New Zealand. But a new point is that other outcomes matter too. Outcomes 3 to 5 are respectively that people's lives are enriched through their connection to nature, that treaty partners, whānau, hapu and iwi are exercising their full role as rangatiratanga and as kaitiaki. And for outcome 5, that prosperity is intrinsically linked with a thriving biodiversity. These are the long list of 2030 targets. I'm not going to dwell on them at length, but it suggests where emphases need to lie. Again, reducing threats, meeting people's needs, and tools and solutions that allow mainstreaming of biodiversity outcomes. And those include things, if we look down towards the bottom right, of equitable participation from Indigenous peoples and gender equality. And Gael has nicely mapped our own targets, the international targets, that's T1 to T23 across the top of the screen there, to the objectives of Te Mana o Te Taiao. And also the colours here represent where current actions are concentrated. Of course, you'll see that it's quite an uneven checkerboard. I should also say that the 2050 goals, the longer term goals, are out there on the left-hand side at the top as well. Let's focus on a couple of the points where we see considerable overlap on that. If we go to objective 10 on your left-hand side of your screen in the Tiaki area, we find that those are activities concentrated in areas around ecosystems are protected, restored, resilient and connected from mountaintops to ocean depths. And of course, those neatly coincide with 2050 goals like Goal A, that ecosystem integrity and resilience are maintained, enhanced and restored. More specifically, when we get to targets, we'll see that again, things are rather concentrated. And I'll draw the example that Maya did last week of target 3, the one where by 2030, 30% of marine, terrestrial and inland waterways are protected. What activities are taking place around that? We can see again are focused in that objective 10, that ecosystems and species are protected and restored and resilient. But equally, there's a lot of activities in that area that are about objective 12, that natural resources are managed sustainably, the central concerns of agencies like MPI, for example. In terms of objectives that are focused around whakahau or tuapapa, getting the system right and empowering actions, we can look at the adequacy that we're meeting target 22 and where activities are concentrated. That's effectively that full and equitable roles are played by Indigenous people in determining biodiversity outcomes. Here we find, for example, that Objective 2 has some activities going on in it. Objective 2 is that treaty partners, whānau, hapu, iwi and Māori organisations are rangatira and kaitiaki. It's important to note an oversight in oversight or whatever you want to read into it in Te Mana o Te Taiao, that there was no emphasis on gender equality in decision making, an aspect that Target 23 is specifically about in the global context. Having emphasised the role of Indigenous people, I will briefly allude to the general process within the outcome monitoring framework of the role of Indigenous people in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And that is a process called Te Ao Māori. It's an explicitly bicultural approach to protecting, restoring, and enhancing biodiversity, and it is specifically designed to meet outcome 4, that treaty partners, whānau, iwi, hapu, are exercising their full role as rangatira and kaitiaki, but of course it pertains to the other outcomes as well. For this to work effectively requires kaupapa Māori monitoring and reporting, evaluation, elevating mātauranga. It requires parallel work by the Crown, Kawanatanga, and by whānau, hapu and iwi. They may intersect periodically. The equality of emphasis may vary from time to time. Resourcing is clearly a problem. For the moment anyway, the efforts being undertaken here are led by my colleague Phil Liver at Manaki Whenua and Puke Timoti also at Manaki Whenua, who co-leads the monitoring and reporting stream of Te Mana o Te Taiao with Elaine. It's supported by MB-funded programs Te Weo Te Kaitiaki and through the Bioheritage National Science Challenge, He Mata I Te Taiao. There's also some funding from DOC. The development of the outcome monitoring framework is what I'll move on to next, and this is really within that realm of kawanatanga. And it is essentially hierarchical in its nature, in which particular outcomes, and I've given those to you before, and I'm just highlighting in green the one here, outcome 3, that people's lives are enriched through connection to nature. And each one of those within that outcome are intermediate outcome statements, objectives, monitoring objectives, and indicators and measures. Unless that all seems too abstract, I'll just take you through one example of those intermediate outcomes that supports that. Intermediate outcome 3.1, that everyone in Aotearoa and New Zealand is connected to people, to nature, and supports and actively contributes to its protection and restoration. And we can drill down towards specific indicators that support that. Here is one that New Zealanders' support for investment in biodiversity and security is measured, and that there are specific measures that support that. We've been through a process where particular indicators and measures are developed up through all of these. That's beyond the scope of today's, but that represents a significant body of work. I want to move now on to how the process of establishing an interagency outcome monitoring framework has taken place. Te mana o te Taiao and its 5 main outcomes sit at the centre of it, hence an outcome monitoring framework. But I do want to acknowledge that over time and through engagement that has expanded, but at least that set the overall structure for an outcome monitoring framework, the capacity to report on achieving any one of those outcomes or them collectively. Over the last 2 years, we've run a process of collaborative engagement and workshops, and that has built on efforts within the Department of Conservation, but through a succession of workshops since involving MPI, Stats New Zealand, Regional Council, Ministry for the Environment and LINZ. And the DOC outcome monitoring framework was a starting point and has expanded out. So that hierarchical structure that I presented in the earlier slide sat as a basis for critique, embellishment, or adding to, and a reference group has developed out of that collaborative process where there's been general consensus about where investment or emphasis among any of the contributing agencies might lie. The output is an interagency outcome monitoring framework. It's an evolving document, it's not a static one. But for now, it allows us to make priorities of general interest, key areas of concern to meet those outcomes. There's a database that allows us to explore interrelationships among the various agencies, where the various policies, laws, and so forth sit that drive the imperatives for that. And they set a basis for an implementation pathway, which indicators and measures should come first, precede others, which are priorities for development. And given that imperative to report in 2026, we have to be mindful of our capacity to report global outcomes as well, hence an explicit alignment to a global monitoring framework. And each one of those, as I've said before, has alignment of particular legislation, policy, and strategy. So that's why an OMF, the outcome monitoring framework, is an evolving document, because we could expect that emphases will change with time. Perhaps after the election, some of those may change substantially. It identifies gaps in investment, but above all, it provides a shared collective vision for coordinated action. A key point made internationally and nationally is that no one agency can be responsible for the implementation of global biodiversity goals. Ultimately, this can be expanded into the NGO community, to local communities and so forth. We're not at that stage yet. I want to shift gear now to how well we can report on environmental outcomes, and the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment in the succession of reports has identified our current state. Because he puts it eloquently, there are huge gaps in our data and knowledge, and they undermine our stewardship of the environment. And along with inconsistent data collection and analysis, it makes it very hard to construct a national picture of where we're going. And we're very reliant on passively gathered data. The system needs to become more proactive. lines of responsibility need to be determined. These are all lessons that emerged from our workshops as well. They reinforce his point. It's not clear who's responsible for providing oversight and leadership of environmental monitoring. The business of passive versus active passive harvesting of data collected by others versus active monitoring. Lines of responsibility are not clear. We've been in the business of opportunistic cobbling together of information for a long time, but it's not clear who's mandated, who's required to report outcomes, and who's accountable for the quality or provision of evidence. The interagency outcome monitoring framework needs to be adapted as it goes, and it has, to accommodate, for example, the underemphasis of biosecurity that was in the earlier iterations. And we're thankful for MPI's engagement in that. It's clear that there's underpinning research that's needed for the best design, particularly in areas that have been hopelessly underinvested, like social indicators. We need to have standards in terms of adequate investment and collection of data and oversight. Transparency, whose data? Of course, there are major lines of responsibility here about Indigenous peoples' intellectual property as well. But for the moment, a lack of national environmental monitoring standards is a problem for the development of many indicators and measures. And of course, data management and curation, whose data, remains an enduring problem. There are things that, it's not as though the situation is hopeless, of course, because there's many indicators that are well in place. If we look at how we go about implementing our progress to reporting the various objectives and outcomes, funding and output indicators is what we do. We're well used to financial accountability here. I might say that I don't think we do quite so well in terms of resourcing indicators around empowering action. But again, changes New Zealand will make. We've had quite a history of development and implementation of some of the indicators that are here, like invasive species. We're well used to reporting outcomes along the lines of whether invasive species dominate ecosystems and alter their ecosystem processes. We're less well able to report in terms of some of the benefits that we will achieve, but again, we're moving towards indicators of nature's contribution to people. Ecological integrity as indicators lies at the heart of legislative reform, like the Natural and Built Environments Act. Adaptation indicators are in their infancy, but go towards managed retreat and other problems that we face as a result of climate change. As we go on, many of these indicators will roll up into global requirements that go towards indices, like the red list of ecosystems, to which I'll return. But ultimately, it is those rolled up indicators that will go towards our capacity to report on the ultimate visions and goals of Te Mana o Te Taiao and the international goals. And again, to emphasize that a lot of activity is taking place and that we're getting beyond uncoordinated responses, we've built consensus around indicators that are generally agreed to be important, such as those in fresh water. Of course, these are high priority. And recent efforts to integrate efforts between regional councils who've been in the business for some time, alongside DOC taking it into the large areas of land that they administer, mean that significant progress is being made. But if we keep doing this, of course, it reinforces the kind of indicators that we're well versed in doing, and we're not necessarily making any progress towards equally important indicators that would measure whether the system was changing or whether communities were feeling empowered. And of course, a Te Ao Māori view about ideal freshwater indicators might look quite different indeed. On the terrestrial front, there's unanimous consensus on a set of in-kind measures to measure everything from land cover to birds and so forth. But the degree of implementation of that is variable across agencies. We'll see that it's quite well developed in the case of birds nationally by DOC and MFE, but only a handful of councils are participating. And where we find areas are shaded, these are developed indicators where no progress has been made at all. So the intent is there, but the delivery is not happening. I talked about the need for rolled up measures and for rolled up indicators and indices, and one that will be absolutely critical for supporting both international and national needs is a red list of ecosystems. That's needed for everything from the NPS, Indigenous Biodiversity and Environmental Reporting Act and so forth. But it will require multiple indicators and measures to achieve it. And we'll need to have not only indicators that we're quite good at measuring, like area, but we'll have to move into active measurement of ecological integrity of ecosystems that are in peril, either because they're naturally rare or much reduced in extent. We'll need to have agreed metrics on risk of collapse, and we'll need to have the sort of things that we don't at the moment of a nationally agreed classification and typology if we're going to do that. But they're critical needs as we move forward. We can build on international investment, and particularly in the biophysical area and to some extent in the social area, this is well developed and developing. International best practice that involves some of us, Elaine and I have been involved in this, as well as Anne Gale, are available and useful to us immediately. The Global Biodiversity Information Facility provides best practice in terms of data management, although there's room for fine-tuning, as I've alluded there, to ensure that Māori intellectual property is observed. So where next? Clearly, investment priorities fall out of this, and we're particularly bereft, I would say, in terms of social data. We need an equitable process around resourcing for active and a process of active collection of data if we're going to get beyond the problems that the PCE identified. We have to have more equality around a Te Ao Māori representation. The collaborative approach we've got is a good one to build on, but we can't be complacent. We need to work better towards national targets, and some of those will also be helped by new legislation. I must say that the role of MB remains unclear to us. Our role in long-term monitoring of ecosystem change is not well supported in this country. We don't really have a habit of it. And environmental governance remains an outstanding issue. I'd like to acknowledge several key people who've been involved in the workshops. They're listed there. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Peter. That's just been great. We have run a little bit short of time for getting into the questions and answers, so I'm just going to put one really quick one, which I think sort of summarises some of the questions that we had. But what does our panel think are the most important things that New Zealand needs to monitor?
It's difficult to put that into a soundbite, but the consensus process identified a number of biophysical indicators that were essential. They underpin policy and legislation. We have a list if people want to see where we got to for that. The critical thing there is the investment in essential data is lacking. And, you know, as you probably have heard before, and you'll hear again, sustained investment and the benefits from time series requires resourcing which is multi-year in the making, and it's not an annual program that will deliver that. So environmental accountability around that investment is the most critical thing, and we have an absolute gap in processes for agreed methodologies in the social indicator space, and an urgent need to fill those gaps. So the detail was not presented here because we felt that it would disadvantage the audience, but the detail is available if people wish to find out more. Do the panel have any other additions they'd like to make?
Look, we're kind of right on time because this was such a rich presentation. So I have to say a big thank you to Peter and Elaine and all the team, and Gail and Jeff and Maya in behind this. This has been a great little mini series. Rest assured, all of those fantastic questions that you've asked will be answered. We'll come back to you directly if you've put your hand up, and we'll also add Q&As to the website so that you can go back to those later, and perhaps add some of the further material that Elaine has mentioned there as well. So I know you've given everybody lots to think about. Thank you so much. Thanks to everybody else who's joined in the conversation. We really appreciate that. There is lots more demand for information and discussion on this topic. So I think we will be coming back to this area in further seminars in the future. So many thanks and bye for now.